When we look back at the history of PS1 horror games, there has always been an intriguing allure that surrounds the many titles and interesting ideas that saw home on the console that would spark a revolution, with many games going on to be seen as groundbreaking within the video game industry, but would also inspire an entire generation of games to follow, even to the current day, where we now see a multitude of different titles from indie developers, mainly, that are trying to revisit and reinvoke this classic style that started all the way back with the original PlayStation in the 90s, that are taking the best of those ideas but putting them into a modern context, but still using the classic PS1 style visuals. But even with that being said, if we look back, there are some very interesting games that were released on the original PlayStation itself that massively stood out. And to be truthfully honest, if these games had not existed in the first place, the landscape of horror games as we see it today would be very different. And one of the games that I think definitely helped to spark that evolution would be Parasite Eve, that would release for the PlayStation in 1998, both in Japan and in North America. Sadly, over here in Europe we never got access to the game, which always left us wondering about how good it was. But luckily enough, in later years, due to emulation, and even with the likes of the PS3, you could access an American account and you could buy the game off the PlayStation store. And even with emulation, we can now play it, which I think is fair to say that now everybody has a chance to play this classic, and that's exactly what it is. With the game sparking interest, also being inspired by a novel of the same name, but would also take massive inspiration from the iconic Resident Evil series that hit great strides when it released in 1996 on the PlayStation. And Squaresoft at the time, that's now Square Enix, wanted to get in on that concept. Now, they were known for creating some of the most legendary RPG games and series in existence, like if we look at Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Cross, among many others. But they would also be one of the first to attempt mixing RPG with survival horror, and they'd done it almost perfectly. But would also utilise various different characteristics, control styles, and even gameplay mechanics that would be similar to games like Final Fantasy VII, but would also move away from it, making it more action orientated, but still had all of the RPG levelling up and consistent traits that you would be familiar with these type of games, which provided a distinctive balance between overall gameplay and progression. Plus, with the story following a young police officer under the name of Aya Bree as she attempts to stop Eve, a woman who ends up almost destroying the human race through spontaneous human combustion, that will see you explore a variety of different areas around New York City, all around the Christmas time period, where monsters are not only being set on fire, but they're also transforming into grotesque and hideous monsters. So it is Aya's job in order to put an end to this madness, but she also finds out that she herself has innate abilities that are similar to that of Eve, which leads her to be able to deal with a lot of the threats that are on hand. Like when this game first released, because of all of the backstory leading up to the game and inspiration behind it, and the amount of work involved, the game received high praise upon reviews and critics, with praising the graphics and the gameplay, but finding that the overall concept had real potential, which it did. But not only that, it also had some of the best and emotion-filled soundtracks ever seen in a video game at the time. That while the gameplay would have been slightly slower paced to the likes of Resident Evil, it also added in a lot of interesting elements and a unique tone that also helped to slow down the gameplay to a degree, but left you with such an ambience and an unnerving atmosphere that provided so much tension, because the build-up was more intoxicating than the event itself. These elements would later be seen in its sequel, Parasite Eve 2, although it would move away slightly from the combat mechanics, as that game tried to focus more on action with more faster paced elements. But it's still a really cool game all the same. And these two games, not only have they got some of the best storytelling, some of the best visuals, but it just has some of the most uniquely stunning concepts ever seen in a video game for that time. Like, even if you compare the visual quality during this generation, the 2 Parasite Eve games on the PlayStation are among some of the most visually stunning games ever seen on the system. And there's enough replayability in them as well to keep you coming back time and again. Even going back from my own personal experience with this, I remember seeing concepts of this firstly in magazines way back in the day, and you could see the hype, and at the time everybody was raving about Resident Evil, because even for myself and my brothers and friends, we were all mad into playing Resident Evil, or even anything that resembled it in some shape or form. So when Parasite Eve was announced, everybody was all excited, but then to only realise that the game wasn't going to get a release in Europe, and that was disappointing. I do genuinely think that the likes of the PlayStation and even Squaresoft missed the mark there. I know when we think back at it, around that time, RPG games, in fairness, weren't really the most popular game concept in Western audiences. They really weren't. It was Final Fantasy VII that really brought this concept to mass appeal, especially when we look at the marketing around that game and how it was literally just put out there into the world, and sure, the novelty of it exploded. But even with that, because of this concept, even though it was RPG based and it had survival horror elements, the funny thing is back then is people were so used to specific themes or concepts around games, and we were very reluctant, especially over here. We weren't really attuned or even open-minded, if you will, towards different types of concepts. Like, make no mistake, like, this game is a masterpiece, but the problem is that if it had to have been sold over in Europe back at that time when it was released, there is a chance, yes, it would have done well, but there's also a chance that it might not have done, because audiences at that time had not warmed to these type of games. We always much preferred like platformers, racing games, more action focused games. RPG games at the time, anything that was slow paced, people over here didn't really take to it, and it took a long time for people to do that. Now it's totally different, and we can appreciate and respect these games. Even for myself personally, I only got to really play this for the first time a couple of years ago because I set up an American account on my PlayStation 3 once I realised I could buy games online, and I figured out that I could get access to this game. That was one of the first things that I did, and I have to say I had a blast with it. The funny thing is, with games like this, it's only really nowadays that people are starting to appreciate and respect these titles, which is a shame really, but I suppose it was really down to the marketing trends at the time, because I think even companies were aware that audiences over in Europe really weren't that familiar or even interested in RPG games. Like I said, it was Final Fantasy VII that opened up that floodgate for these games to even exist, really. Like, there were a few on the PlayStation, but they were often overlooked, and nobody ever really talked about them all that much. But then obviously when Final Fantasy VII came out, that did change the whole landscape of the way people perceive games. But it still took a couple of years for that to happen, because even though there was a lot of RPG games coming out on the PlayStation, people kind of stuck to what they knew, and that was generally a thing back then. So if you played Final Fantasy VII, people were more likely to play the sequels rather than to play something else. So I'd imagine that that's one of the reasons why this game did not get a release over here in Europe, is because it genuinely probably would not have sold well. People probably may not have taken to it at all. Yes, even though it has survival horror elements, which everybody did enjoy, but because it had RPG elements and slow paced gameplay, it probably would not have been to everyone's liking. But then in saying that, when Parasite Eve 2 released a couple of years later, that was more welcoming and receiving. But I think then, I suppose by that point, audiences all around the world had become more familiar with those games, even though it was only like 3 or 4 years at this point, but people had become more attuned with them, and quite rightly so, because, like, I'll be honest, Parasite Eve is a masterpiece. It and its sequel, it's one of the best survival horror games on the PlayStation, and quite possibly one of the greatest survival horror games of all time. Because like I said at the start of the video, without this particular game here, if you take Resident Evil and all those other games out of the equation, I think Parasite Eve is just as important for the evolution of the survival horror genre as much as any other game. And if this game didn't exist, I don't think we would ever see the flood of game types that we would see today. So this title has a lot going for it, and it still stands the test of time, because if you go and play this game now with emulation, you can bump up the graphics and scale everything up, and it was a stunning game back then, it's a stunning game now. There's no ifs or buts about it. Definitely one recommended to try. I will be going back to play this, even though I have put a bit of time into it, but there's still a lot more that I have yet to discover in the game, and it's just one of those games that I know I'll never forgive myself if I don't play the whole way through it and actually get everything that's available in the game through multiple playthroughs, because I played through Parasite Eve 2 an awful lot, and that for me is an exceptional game, one of my favourite games on the PlayStation, and this one here is definitely right up there as well. It has all of the elements of survival horror, RPG. It has also got one of the best cinematic styles and almost like movie style qualities that you'll ever find in a video game for that time. If anything, it is a true cinematic experience. Like, when we look at the intros and everything, you actually think that you're watching a movie. Like, when you think about it, this game really was ahead of its time. Definitely worth playing in my book, 100%. But aside from what I think of this game, what are your thoughts of this masterpiece? Are you a fan of the series? Is this your favourite game in the series? And do you still even go back to play it every so often? I would love to hear whatever stories you do have with this excellent game, so be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around more survival horror games like this that were also released on the PlayStation, then make sure to leave a like on the video, and you can also check out a playlist here on screen that I have covered previously with a load of other videos so that you can see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.